start webinar? Okay.
Recording in progress.
Okay, we're going to get started in about another minute or so. Okay, let's get started. So, good afternoon. My name is Dennis Sullivan. I'm the head of Reference and Readers Advisory here at the Pearl River Public Library. So, it's wonderful to see many faces today. So, thank you very much for coming into the library. It's a very unique program. We're able to have a program here at the library, right, live on Facebook, and live via Zoom. So we have people home all around the country watching, listening in. So today's it's a very unique program. It's going to be a listening program. So those who are watching here live at the library, you're going to be able to see Richard Connolly do his presentation. But those on Facebook and on Zoom, you're going to, it's orchestrated as a listening program. So welcome to a series called Here We Are. The first of the series, Shanks Village Stories, 1947 to 1954, with Richard Connolly. Between 1947 and 1954, Richard Connolly lived with his family in Shanks Village, a cooperative community in Orangeburg located on the former Camp Shanks, the largest United States Army embarkation camp during World War II. Connolly will tell stories about life in this community and how a diverse group of people live together as neighbors. So Richard Connolly is a producer and a publisher with 53 years of experience as a college teacher. In 1995, Connolly presented a selection of Here We Are interviews at a United Nations World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen, Denmark. This led to a collaboration with UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, in Paris, France, and Hamburg, Germany, and also India National Television in New Delhi, India, and the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Richard will return to the Pearl River Public Library on Thursday, November 4th at 12:30 for another listening program. Here We Are, Rocklin State Hospital Stories, 1931 to 2021. You will also be invited back via email as well, so keep an eye out for that. So now it is our pleasure to introduce Richard Connolly.
Thank you, Dennis. It's really wonderful that you're here. It's fascinating to me what led me to think to do this, and when some of you were walking in and I sensed that you had lived in Shanks Village, what I thought I would do today is to do the essence of the presentation as I had envisioned it and leave some extra room for interaction, kind of hear from you, because this is the first of a series that I'm imagining could evolve from one library to another, starting today through this year into next year. So on the seat that you're sitting in, there's a piece of paper there that I put onto the page and onto the chair, and it's designed to suggest something about what I'm imagining this experience will be in terms of listening. You're facing west, I'm facing east. If people are hearing me, Facebook, Zoom, wherever they are, they're imagining a voice somewhere in space and time. For me, the early years of my life, the memories of them, are from Shanks Village. I was born on April 12th, 1945, the day that Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. I was born on that day, and then 2 years later, we moved from New Jersey to this place, Shanks Village. So my earliest memories are from the geographical place, which is toward my east here, toward the Hudson River. If I visualized it in words for an audience that doesn't have any visuals in front of them, I could say that I can imagine to my left, to my north, Central Avenue and Pearl River running down parallel to where the library is. In back of me, to my west, is a railroad track that extends north and south, as well as a highway that extends there. All of these are reference points for my memories of the period between 1947 and 1954, when we moved from Shanks Village to West Nyack, where my grandparents had lived for several generations before that. So here are a couple of interconnected stories from those early years of Shanks Village. And the segue will be that the more I remember those first 9 years, 7 to 9 years, throughout my life, the more I remember how influential the experience was, how particular memories of how things were in that place led me to become who I've become throughout a lifetime. They were very, very specific memories, and the more I remember them, the more I see their significance. So my earliest memories of Shanks Village are going to the elementary school and to the kindergarten, which are in a building that's now the library, the Orangeburg Library. And that building, as I remember it, was set up with classrooms and then a cafeteria area in the basement. And I remember it because I remember vividly walking into the places, into the spaces, and seeing faces of people who were white and black with no separation whatsoever. And the barracks that we lived in for the couple of years leading up to my going to school, they were barracks that were set up in apartments, 3 apartments in each barracks. And there were 2 barracks facing one another. So there was a kind of space in between. And my earliest memories are of kids playing sports between the buildings and behind the buildings. And there was no division whatsoever. So my earliest memories of seeing the world were through this world of our being the same. And as I've told Dennis and others over the years, my mother reinforced that idea. So she would always say, we're the same. And that insight into a reality that I saw from many different perspectives over the years shaped the way that I began to remember what followed when we moved to West Nyack and in the years since then. So 1947, 1954 are the frame, and then what happened from 54 through the 60s, 70s, up to the present. All of that comes together in my mind more and more the more I concentrate on those early memories. And what I began to sense in this was that those of us who experienced that time in America after World War II and are looking at the world that we live in now through that prism, our memories of that time, when the media came into our lives, when radio was there, when television was there, all of those memories are shaping the latter years of our lives on the basis of how much of that we can recall. So here are a couple of interconnected stories with it. When I was in the 3rd grade in the elementary school, there was a family called the Cults, C-A-L-T, and one of my closest friends in that class was Stephen Cult. And Stephen's father was a graduate student at Columbia. What distinguished my family from Stephen's family and others was that my father wasn't at Columbia University, but he worked on assembly lines and he was a seasonal worker. So sometimes of the year he would work as a greenskeeper, work at Delwood Country Club. Other times of the year he was working on assembly lines. So it was workers living in the community, and the workers were African American, European American, Jews, Christians, Catholics. We were all part of that world. And what began to happen in my recollection of it is that certain of those individuals that were classmates of mine had lives that were different than mine. because of their educational background. And the Colt family were a family of artists connected to Columbia University. And I befriended Stephen Colt during those years. And his friendship is an example of how a particular friendship relationship at the time shaped everything in my life that followed it. And what it was that Stephen began to be connecting in his life to the music that was beginning to be recorded and played on the radio, with jazz and blues records leading into rock and roll music in the 1950s. And Stephen began to work with musicians whose songs were later recorded by British groups and American blues rock groups. And Stephen's research into the folk musicians, the folk blues musicians, in particular a musician called Skip James, whose songs later were recorded by Cream and other British groups. But Stephen was this kid in my class with me that we were listening to these records on the radio in those early years. We didn't have television yet. And the sounds of those types of music, which began to be labeled as rock and roll music at the time, it began to shape the way that Stephen and I talked about things. So I was a grammar school kid with him, and I can still remember the conversations we had, hearing songs on the radio and talking about them. And if I were to play this as kind of a slow dissolve into a movie leading up to the present, decades later, during an event in Vermont where I was doing a presentation about the history of music, Stephen Colt was there. And Stephen had been the folklorist who had worked with these artists to bring them back on tours that took place during the 1950s and 1960s. So my point is that there were these specific relationships that were formed in Shanks Village that led me to see things over time in the ways that I've come to see them. So here's the one that I'll tell this with a build-up to a punchline in a way. I'll end this story emphatically with something that happened in 2020 during the pandemic. And it wouldn't have happened in the way that it did if it weren't for the backstory that takes me back to Shanks Village and when we moved from Shanks Village to West Nyack. Because I had seen everything through the prism of everybody's the same for the early years of my life, when we moved in 1954 to West Nyack, 5 miles or so away from where I lived before, what I began to see was a world of division. And as I've pointed out over the years telling this particular story, in 1963, when I graduated from Clarkstown High School, there was one African-American student in the class. So what shaped the reality from those early perceptions that I had at Shanks Village to where I was throughout the 50s and 60s, I began to learn what that was about and to see it. And a big factor in it for my family and the others from Shanks Village is that in the same banks that were giving loans for mortgages to some families, they weren't giving them to others. Same assembly lines, same workers. So I, as a kid, began to see this reality in the way that I did. And it was through the conversations I had within my family about this that I came to understand this. And years later, I was working my way through college. I coincidentally worked at Marine Midland branches throughout Rocklin County. So I saw how mortgages were done when I was in high school. So I saw the world of Rocklin County through these two distinct prisms or windows within 2 decades of my life. And these are the sorts of stories that the more I think about them, the more I think that they're potentially valuable to be sharing with one another now in a kind of archival oral history way in order for us to remember how we came to be where we are, literally and figuratively right now. Like as I often say, everything that happened in the cosmos had to happen for us to be here at this moment. How did we come to be here? And how are our stories connected to one another if we were to share them through a prism like the Shanks Village stories? So 2 stories, the one connecting up to the present from last year to suggest what I have in mind for how we might talk with one another about these stories and begin to weave them together a bit. Okay? So the story of Shanks Village, early years, moving to West Nyack, issues of mortgages, how this is working out in terms of the fabric of Rocklin County. Slow dissolve to 2020, it's the pandemic, and I received a message via an email extension that the mortgage that I have on a property in Warwick for my family can be refinanced. And it was one of these online messages from a corporate organization. Some of you may know it's called Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper had bought out the banks with the mortgages in Rockland County. So this name popped up on the screen and I'm going, this is kind of amazing, what is this? And I called the phone number and I was expecting a bot of some sort. I wasn't expecting a human being. Okay, good? Okay, so I wasn't expecting to hear a voice, but I heard a voice and immediately I recognized the voice as being a southern voice, an accent that I understood in my mind was from Mississippi or from one of the states in the South. And I heard the voice and my memories of childhood came to me. And I was thinking of Shanks Village while I heard this voice. It was this curious kind of moment in my life where there was a convergence of a kind. Within the next 5 minutes of this online conversation, I learned that this was an African-American man in Houston, Texas, who would be the person who would determine whether I would get the mortgage on the house in Orange County in 2020. And all of these threads of the story of going back to the 1940s, 1950s came to me in that instance. That kind of connection, that kind of meaningful coincidence, to use Carl Jung's notion of synchronicity, is an idea that I live with, and it's where my mind goes when I think of doing this series of stories at the libraries, to see whether the connections of stories would lead us to open up to a deeper awareness of who we are as residents of the Hudson Valley region right now, how we came to be here, what stories might be recorded and remembered for a next generation to consider when talking about how history is told and how people in different parts of America tell the stories of the places where we live. So if we look at the Shanks Village stories and then the Rocklin State Hospital stories, which I'll do some of next month, I'm going to do one in West Nyack where I'll look at where we were leading up to the Tappan Zee Bridge and then following it. And then in December, I'm going to do one at the Nyack Library, which connects synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, and local history. And in that one, it will look through the prism of how in 1809, Washington Irving wrote the first history of the Dutch, and it was a fiction. And people thought it was real. And it was promoted as though it was real history by putting fake advertisements into newspapers beginning in September of 1809. So these kinds of fictions and true stories will converge during this series of 4 presentations. And in setting it up for today, when I saw so many of you coming in and heard that some of you lived in Shanks Village, my thought was to engage you rather than to go on with my approach to it, because I'm truly interested in what led you to come here today when you heard that there were going to be stories of Shanks Village being told. Is there anyone in particular who, you had said that you lived between 1947?
No, that was her. I was born there in 1950.
So you were born in 50. Do you have a recollections of the early years of Shanks Village?
Very much. I loved living in Shanks Village. It was my best place in growing up.
What,
Was living in Shanks Village.
what was it about it that you remember?
It had to do with everybody was basically the same. We were all in the same category. Nobody had really more than anybody else. And at that time, the war was over, you know, and my father was in World War II, and he was in the infantry in Connolly. And I was 4 years old when I moved there, so I came from Nye, I was born in Nye. But I was 4 years old when I moved there, and we stayed throughout the whole time till it closed. And we didn't want it to close. We were very satisfied there because it was economical. Everybody seemed to. I had a black family living next to us. You said there were 3, which is what we lived in. I was in the middle, and my best girlfriend, who was Betty Rucker, I wish she was here. I would love to see her again. She was my best friend through all the time. That we were all the same, like you were saying, and a close community. And it was. I went to Tappan Grammar School, is where I went to, and so we didn't want to leave. We would have still been there.
And how many people from that time are you still in contact with? Anyone?
Unfortunately, no.
No.
No, really not. Everybody had. Once it broke up, I heard Betty had moved to Nyack, which is where I was born. My parents moved to Volga, because we all had to find a place to live.
Right.
But then it changed because it wasn't as equal as like you said. It's just that everybody was the same, and even financially, everything was nice.
Well, nobody had much money. I mean,
No,
a lot
at that time.
of the fellows were living on stipends. The guys that were going to Columbia and other colleges in the city, they were living on with their families, $120 a month. And so no one had any money. So it just seemed we were all the same, like you said. There was no competition about money or having things, or it was pretty, but I just remember it as being a very happy time in my life.
Yes, me too.
I remember always the gangs of kids. Where were their parents? It was
Oh,
like,
yeah. No, that was the happiest time in my life as a child growing up.
Yeah.
And we moved to Volga. Volga was good. It was fine. I had 2 years there. Then we moved to Nyack. We didn't move to Nyack. I went to Nyack High School, and we lived in Volga. We either had Clarkstown or Nyack at that time to go to. And I didn't like Nyack High School.
with it, and then run forwards and swing out into the air, and how that line never dropped off.
I had a lot of boys living around when we were, and I was playing, I love baseball, so I was playing baseball with the boys and everything. 'Cause there are more boys than where I live
Yeah.
anyway, than girls, except for Betty, who was my boys all the time. And it was a simple life. Oh, we had do you remember the oil stove?
The oil drums that were outside. were
I
the oil-
sat on it thinking it was a horse, playing, it was a horse. And that's how we heated up the whole inside.
That was the only, you know, those barracks were not insulated,
Yeah.
and that the oil drum and the oil stove that was in the living room,
Was
that
in the
little
living
living room,
room,
and it had a glass door, but if you touched that glass,
She
You got
hurt her
burned.
hands. She
Yeah.
was just starting to walk, and she was walking around, and she put her hands on that oil stove, and burnt. She screamed all day,
right?
But it wasn't a fancy place at all. But it was
Well, just let me introduce this just in terms of my approach to this. Two things come to mind as you were talking here. One is the sense that even though we were very close to Manhattan, there was a sense that we really were in a rural place, in that sense of it. And this is preceding December of 1955 when the Tappan Zee Bridge opened. So part of what my memories are of our childhood, and I happen to remember that vine.
You do?
I do. So it's just that sense that we were in a place that was shaped by the sense that we were in the country, even though we were near New York City, right? So this is, again, a particular story that is from my perspective, which leads me to remember it in the way that I remember it, okay? So in the postcard that I had made up for the event, you see that there's a photograph of me there in the postcard from 1954. It's taken in Shanks Village, the year that we moved to West Nyack. And I have this vivid memory of that photograph because of the particulars of what happened within the family in that year. But the key to it was that I was consciously imitating Jackie Robinson. All right? I was trying to be like Jackie Robinson. He was my favorite baseball player. And I can remember being able to go to Ebbets Field when I was playing Little League ball and seeing him play there and having a memory of that. Right? So you have that kind of memory that reinforces we're all the same. The white kid living here in this environment imitates the black kid and becomes like him. All of that kind of experience. So in 1954, the summer that we moved to West Nyack, I have a vivid memory of, in my mind, it's about 11 o'clock, maybe 10:45 at night, and I'm outside of the Polo Grounds, and the Dodgers were playing with the Giants, and the game was going into extra innings. So we had to get home to Shanks Village. And in the car on the way home, we were listening to the game that we had attended. And in my memory of childhood, that was one of the most significant memories of Shanks Village in relation to radio and then later television, is that I attended an event and then heard it broadcast and followed it. And I was such a fan of the team at the time that I said, I have to stay up. And the rest of the family went to sleep. And then on that June night in 1954, I listened and I listened. It went into 14 innings, and I kept listening to this event, picturing the baseball field that I had been at earlier, and having that memory shape the way that everything for me began to change throughout the 1950s into the 1960s. Because all of a sudden, what was brought into the house when we moved to West Nyack was what we referred to as radio with images. So the television started to come in, and that screen began to shape everything from 1954 right up to the present. I think it's one of the reasons I said to Dennis, how about if we don't have any images for this Zoom, but we're just listening, that we're kind of remembering what it was like before the image defined our perception of everything. So the minute you saw the talking head, you were prejudiced in one way or another, consciously or unconsciously. You weren't hearing a voice from a distance that you identified with or not. The images started to take over. And one of the things about this series that I thought might be interesting to build upon is how our memories are in relation to voices and texts as well as to images, and how we remember what we remember. I told Dennis this earlier. It was a kind of an interesting moment when I was putting together the program for today and thinking of how to do it. I moved back a couple of years ago into the house that I grew up in West Nyack. And it was the house that we moved into on July 5th, 1954. And in the attic of the house that my mother lived in for most of her life, there are still some boxes of things that are hers that I haven't gone through yet. And my mother was of a generation where she always felt that as a woman, you always carried a purse. You always had your purse with you because whatever was in it was yours and you carried it. And when her mother, my grandmother, died in 1941 in California, the purse came back and remained in one of the boxes in the house when I was preparing for this program. So I opened it up and saw my grandmother's purse from when she died in 1941, and it was in a box with some other things like manila folders and so forth. And as I was opening the purse up, this folder fell down, and the photo that I used of myself imitating Jackie Robinson came out. That was the only photo there. Right? These are the sorts of what I refer to as meaningful coincidences that inform the way that I'd like these presentations to be in sharing these kinds of stories. I wouldn't have heard your stories leading me to have a memory of that vine if somehow we hadn't managed, with all the choices we have in our lives now, to be in the same room at the same time having these kinds of conversations. To me, these are very hopeful. They're hopeful stories based upon where our lives converge and where the stories of those moments of coincidence and convergence lead us to do the next thing. What I'm thinking to do, I told Dennis this, Dennis was a student of mine. How long ago were you in the classes, Dennis?
16 years ago.
16 years ago. So in courses at Rocklin Community College that I was teaching at the time, I integrated this idea of meaningful coincidence into the presentations. So what you have that I handed out here is something that I've used for decades in teaching, that in the moment, we're in a particular geographical place. We're somewhat geographically conscious and historically conscious wherever we are. And it was some of that experience with Dennis that led him to think that we might do this presentation and this series. So if I were to segue into a very recent story to demonstrate how important I think it is to do this kind of thing, I went back to teaching at Rocklin Community College in classrooms a month ago in September, after having taught online. And the buildings on the campus are vacant. There's a kind of like my first sense of it was it's like the Nanuet Mall, you know, before it closed. So I'm walking onto this campus and it's empty, but there are some classes being taught in some of the rooms. And I observed this, remembering some of the things that I just quickly told you about from my early memories of walking into a classroom as a young kid in the 1950s, like what it was like. And I was thinking this as I walked around the campus at the college, and what I saw was room after room after room where classes were being taught, where all the lights were out. People the screens were lighting their faces, and there was a projection system where there were images on the screen, and there was a teacher in a room with a computer controlling the images on the screen in PowerPoints for people to type in their notes from. And as I was walking past it, I had this recollection, again, because I was thinking of this presentation, of what it was like for me as a kid to walk into a room and see people and have that memory. And I was thinking how amazing it is that in the period between the 1940s and now, we're at this point of converging media here in the way that the media are being used. And it led me to a particular experience, which I'll share with you, kind of a dramatic one, to suggest what might happen if. As I was preparing for one of the classes, I was observing that there were only a few students nearby. So it wasn't as though the hallways were filled. But I saw a couple of students, a young boy and a young girl, each of them holding a smartphone. And they were nervous to a point of being frantic, like this kind of body language, physically, moving their hands. And I could hear their voices saying, why don't you tell us where to go? We never know where the room is. I don't know where I'm supposed to be. And they're looking at their phones. And they were really nervous to a point where when I walked over to them, I sensed that I might frighten them just by walking over. So I was very gentle about it. I said, may I help? And they were still panicking. And I said, is it okay if I look over your shoulder at the screen on the phone? And one of them, the boy, said yes. And I looked at the screen, and the number that was prominently on both his screen and the young woman standing next to him was the room that they were standing in front of. They weren't in this world, they were in cyberspace. And any thought that they needed to be in this world was, no, I know where and I'm thinking, a lot has happened since I walked into a grammar school in Shanks Village to lead to a point that this is where we are in 2021. And how we got here is so subjective in a way. Each of us has our own version of how we've navigated this throughout our lives. And my thought was, what if some of these stories began to be shared in the context of this Here We Are series? That the we in the Here We Are is those of us who are here and feel engaged to talk about this. Are any of you, were you aware that Rocklin State Hospital was in existence when we were in Shanks Village? So were you aware of it in terms of what it was like then? Did you ever go to Rocklin State Hospital during that period?
I worked there personnel.
You did? Years later? Was that years later? Yeah.
I worked in recreation.
When did you work there?
I started in 1966. My mom and dad both worked there.
So they worked there during the 50s? So when Nathan Klein became the administrator, he was the administrator in charge? Yeah?
My mom is from Pearl River. And my mom and dad met. My dad was in service, came back to Camp Shanks, left from Camp Shanks, came back. He went to Red Rail in Nanuet and met my mom.
Yeah.
And a couple months later, my mom left Pearl River, and we moved to Corning, where my dad's from. We eventually ended up back here. My mom started back working at Rocklin State. And then my dad worked there. We grew up in the county. And I and my brother both worked there. So it's like we've, it's just been all the stuff you're talking about, I know.
Yeah.
And
So-
I want to know when I can come back to hear more about Rockland State.
Well, what I'll do, I was so impressed by the fact that so many of you were here today that I thought rather than start talking and not knowing you, that I would just ask a little bit before I go into any more detail about this. But what I've done is to track my life in detail from the period that I can remember. And I know that my earliest memory is seeing a photograph. So I saw a photograph of the blizzard of 1947. I remember being shown that photograph a couple of years later. So I know that my memory is the photograph rather than the actual Christmas weekend of 1947. But what I've done, and what I was thinking I would do in greater detail today until I saw people showing up here in the way that you have, is that I would go through the subtleties of those memories in relation to who I am now, and how I see things through the prism of those very particular early memories. And one of them, which I'll get at more in the next programs if you're interested in the details of it, is that Dennis read this biography of me. In the 1980s into the 1990s, I came up with an idea for a locally based community program content, and I called it Here We Are. And I hosted one-on-one and group interviews using cable television and radio at the time. And I told some of the stories that I told briefly today, wove them together. And I brought people in from different parts of the world to be part of this. And I ended up being asked to do a presentation for the United Nations, as Dennis read, in Copenhagen, where I took some of the local oral history recordings on video and audio and did a presentation not unlike this. It was just happened that there were people from different parts of the world who were hearing the Here We Are idea. And it led me to produce programs that connected stories of women doing literacy work in rural communities in India, and people in South Africa, and people in Detroit, and people in different places where the we in the Here We Are began to connect to different geographical locations. And during the pandemic, I started thinking about this again, because I did all of my courses during the pandemic without any cameras. So students heard my voice, and I was listening to theirs. And it got me thinking that maybe we could engage in that kind of storytelling using our voices and record them and create this little series this year and see how it might evolve over the next time. One thing that impressed me, John showed me this, I didn't know this before, Dennis, is that there's a writing group that is working here too. Are any of you involved in? So are some of your stories in these collections? Oh, this is great. So we have an opening here. This is wonderful. When did you become involved with that group?
5 years ago, right? 5 years. 2 years.
And had you been interested in writing before? In this?
A little when I was in high school, but that was it. And I went into art, and then I left that to go into writing.
And is any of the writing, I haven't looked carefully yet, is any of the writing memoir writing where you're?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
And in that writing, how far back can you remember? What are your earliest memories?
There was one that I wrote about being a little girl about 5 years old. A true story.
Okay.
Memoir.
And
Mine was about the same time too, about 5.
And had you lived with that memory over time, and this was an opportunity to put it down, or did thinking about memoir writing call it up?
I think it was the latter.
The latter?
Yeah.
Because that's what I keep wondering in terms of, how we remember what we remember. And would there be value in consciously concentrating on the notion of memory in order to bring up stories like the ones I began to tell today, for all of us?
One thing that these ladies were saying about how poor everybody
But yet, if one were to map out Rocklin County at that time, if we would have gone into Upper Nyack or different places, we would have seen Gilded Age homes and properties there. So it was nearby. And the question was, how did that start to come together after Shanks Village closed? Two things I would just point out to put it into a kind of, with a little bit of historical context for it. On Central Avenue, right in the Pearl River, when there was the high school here, where I played sports in 1950s, 60s, there was a pizza place. I don't know if any of you were here at that time. But next to it, in the 1950s, when I was in high school and came over here, there was a bookstore, and it was a John Birch Society bookstore. And it was fascinating. I was interested in books at the time. And I remember buying copies of these books and having them. And it opened up my awareness of the right-wing sensibilities in the county at the time. And I began to follow it. This was when I was in high school. Same person, same time frame. Late 50s, early 60s, I began to realize that in Upper Nyack, there was something called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was this pacifist organization that, among other things, was the umbrella under which Martin Luther King learned nonviolence. So this was happening during our lifetimes in Rocklin County, these kinds of local connections. Once one begins to recognize them, one sees that in a kind of amazing way sometimes, Rocklin County is really a microcosm of the nation. We can see the patterns here. And one way to understand them is to remember them, to start to remember as much as we can about our lives and begin to see where each of us has become who we've become because of the convergence of these things, including media, which is so, I could go into a whole realm of stories that connect to how the music business and the entertainment business and movies and all of it are intimately connected with the history of Rocklin County in the last 100 to 150 years. Things like Adolf Zucker's estate becoming now Paramount Pictures, and groups like the Isley Brothers and Jimi Hendrix playing at the Palisades, what's now the Palisades Center, because the Isley Brothers had a studio in Stevens Landing. And things like this that weave together the popular culture, the media culture, and the particular places where we live here. It's
Helen Hayes lived in Nyack.
right, right.
And she was so, of course, well known. Everybody loved.
I'll mention something just in case. Do any of you know the name Maxwell Anderson? Yeah.
He was a playwright, wasn't he?
Right. Right. Do you know the name Kurt Weill? Right. Well, in the 1980s, I wrote and produced a documentary for PBS. It was called Lost in the Stars, which is a song that Kurt Weill wrote with Maxwell Anderson for a musical in the 1940s. And I'll mention it to you now. I was able to get the old analog tapes and digitize them, and I was able to edit them digitally and remix the audio. So I have a 50-minute documentary, which sometime we could watch if you were interested in it. It looks at Rocklin County through South Mountain Road in New City. Maxwell Anderson moved to South Mountain Road in New City in 1922. And because of his success as a playwright and film writer, he brought Burgess Meredith here and wrote plays for him. Helen Hayes was living in Nyack at the time. And the story of Broadway theater and film are directly connected to that little expanse of land from where the farm is, the orchards in Pomona, and where the brickyards are in Haverstraw. One property after another is connected to the arts in America, visual arts, performing arts. So all of these places exist for us to share stories with. So, yes.
Your photo raised a memory for me.
Oh, great.
I want to ask you about the truck.
Okay.
Can you explain the truck?
Yeah, do you remember it?
Yes.
Yeah, it was, tell it to see if I'll tell it my way. During that time, there were bakeries that had trucks that went around and delivered rolls and cakes and things. And what? Dugan's was one of them. Yeah, right. So you have a memory of that.
Yes.
Are those fond memories of having those deliveries? It was magic at the time. Yeah.
And the cupcakes that you could rip the icing off of. And just eat the icing and throw it.
Right. So you have where do you remember that from?
From the Bronx.
So you remember it from there, yeah. And the origins of that go back into the 19th century, where it was German bakers who had the trucks. It's just, again, if you kind of follow it a little bit further back in each generation, you get to these interesting connections of where these images and sounds go. This is great.
Our wedding cake was from Duke. We must have ordered it.
I love their cupcakes.
Are there any questions that you have that I could follow up with you on? Anything that would resonate with you if I had an email question from you?
I just remember there's one thing that, a number of things, but anyway, the first television, my mother finally got a TV, and once I got that television, that was my friend, and it still is my friend today. I love my television, unfortunately, sometimes unfortunately, but I just remember that.
Have any of you ever seen, it's from a while ago, but you know the director Barry Levinson? Yeah, he made a film called Avalon. Have any of you ever seen that? If you ever have an opportunity to see it, given what you just said, it tells the story of Baltimore and the immigrant population in relation to television, because as an immigrant family, they began to become involved in selling radios and televisions. And what it does, it's stylized as a film, but I think it gets at something where across a couple of generations, what you saw happen was that the first television set was brought into the space. There was a test signal, and the kids were in front of it just looking and listening to the test signal. Within 12 to 16 years, that had taken over the space to a point that nobody sat together and had a meal together anymore. You had the TV tables, where you could, for the TV dinners. And eventually, sadly, at the end of the film, you see the first generation person in a retirement, in a senior home, Thanksgiving weekend, and the television screens are on. And you see what happened between 1950 and the present, where these screens have become more the attention getter than the geographical places that we're in. And as I say, that's one of the reasons I thought it might be interesting to engage in this kind of conversation. If you're interested, I'm working with students who are teenagers, so I have high school students now. These students are probably, without exaggeration, almost totally addicted to the screen and to the sounds that are coming from the screen. They cannot go to sleep at night without it right next to them. It's on all night long. They wake up with it, program the music so it's on nonstop. The idea of having an inner life and solitude, no, it's not part of their experience. And that's why it was so troubling to me to think that schools would jump into this screen mode rather than engaging people to come back after the pandemic.
When I think of Shanks,
Yeah.
I think of gangs of kids, outside all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, our parents would say, get out, go play, right? And there were enough of us so that we could play all day long and be in the woods and be in nature. I mean, that's what I remember, be in the swamp, trying to catch frogs. Life was real. And I'm very grateful that I lived when I lived and where I lived. I mean,
But I think,
standing outside the room where they're supposed to be, and because the phone isn't telling them that.
well, I think that to me, the significance was that they were engaged in the screen and not looking at the number. You know, it's that kind of disconnect that we now take for granted. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, you know, they don't make eye contact with one another. It's another to be lost in cyberspace for 18 hours a day, and even when people are sleeping, it's on. You know, that's how extreme it's gotten in our lifetimes.
But more and more, we're trading real experiences for a virtual life.
Right.
So we don't go shopping anymore. You don't meet your friends for lunch. You know, I mean, it's hard to me. It's heartbreaking. Lord and Taylor's Dine was the end. And now they're online. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, location, so the location, say like 2 square miles. Could you reference what's the closest thing, like Orangetown Town Hall, or, because I walk a lot of the area, I do find remnants, a lot of remnants of Camp Shanks. I'd love to relive that history. I mean, I've actually found foundations, but could you tell me the closest reference point, being like Orangetown Town Hall, maybe?
It went from like Leicester Drive down to 303,
Right.
right? And
Well,
it included part of Tappan, the part that was nearest Orangeburg, and a little bit of Louisville.
But where the town hall is there, if you look at that as being where the Palisades Parkway entrance is that goes north there, if you were to face south there, and you were where I was as a kid in the late 40s, early 50s, you would have seen barracks there, and you would have seen buildings that were designed for community there. And where I lived there are now developments there, the split level houses, but I would either walk or ride my bicycle down past what is now the town hall, and then go further down toward 303, where the college is there on the left, the brick building. That became a grammar school, an elementary school,
Right.
which I attended in the early 50s. So that was there, and then where Tappan Zee High School is, right, that was all part of Shanks Village. And where down toward Dominican, the convent and all, there was an enormous baseball field that was situated in a kind of valley. And my earliest memories of watching semi-pro baseball, when they used to have teams of semi-professional players come around and play. They would play on the grounds of Rocklin State Hospital, and they would play in that space, Tappan, what's now the TZ High School, and then in Nyack and in Spring Valley. So there was a network in Rockland County of baseball teams that played in the different towns and villages. And this is where, you know, the African American, European American, we were kids playing sports together, and then we went to high school and we continued to be friends and we played. So if Haverstraw played Spring Valley or Clarkstown played Nyack, you remembered your childhood. Remember we were on the same playing field in 1952 learning how to play baseball. So these are memories that I think will really be lost unless they're somehow cultivated over time. Yeah.
When I lived in Camp Shanks, I lived the pro closet is, there was barracks behind there, and where the town hall is now was the fire department.
Right.
Because I can remember the first time going to my new home when I was 5. My grandfather was walking me to the house, and the fire was on off the scale like that. So that's where the fire department was. And then if you walk down, because we walked everywhere when we were kids, down by the railroad tracks where Prell Gardens are, the condos, there was a store there, and it was called Sid's.
Yes.
And we would shop there all the time, like 5 to 10. You could get everything in there.
There was nothing.
So that's
Will any of you be able to be here for the next one that I do about Rocklin State?
When is that?
That, you have the card here?
So it'll be on Thursday, November 4th at 12:30.
The reason I ask is that if I know that some of you are going to be here, what I would do is what I had planned to do more of today, which is to go into greater detail about the stories of Shanks Village. But when I saw so many of you here with memories, I thought the time would be better spent listening than my going into intricacies that might not be of interest to you. But I think that the Rocklin State Hospital story from 1931 till now is an interesting 90-year story. I have my own memories of it, but I've researched it over the years, and it's truly an amazing story of a great many threads of American European culture. For instance, the introduction of LSD into use among psychiatric patients happened through Nathan Klein in the 50s. You had Allen Ginsberg writing his poems in Howl to Rocklin, where his friends were mental patients at the time. So it's really an amazing 90-year story. And if you're interested, I can go into that in greater detail the next time. But I really appreciate your coming. It was just, I don't take these things for granted, how amazing it is that we happen to be here to connect in this way.
I just want to mention
Yeah.
one thing. My father worked in gears, but then became Continental Can.
Right.
That was in Fairmont.
Right.
And there's a plaque out there now that they had put years ago of the people that were drafted or had to leave to go to World War II, and his name is on there.
Yeah.
Like gears, that he worked in gears, and these people had to go to World War II. So his name is on there. It's kind of very exciting to see. You know, I have my kids and grandkids go down and take a look at it.
I wish they'd saved at least one barracks though, because the memorial that's behind the Orangeburg school,
Yeah.
that's a Quonset hut.
Right.
Yeah,
The GIs didn't really live in those.
very disappointing going,
Very.
very disappointing.
And there's nothing back Shanks Village anywhere.
You
It's
just got
historic.
people that, you know, went to war there.
Right.
Sitting in farmhouse.
And I think not only Camp Shanks, but Shanks Village is historic. I mean, what happened there in the time that it happened, everybody living together.
Do you know Scott Weber's book?
Yeah, Shanks Village and, yeah, Camp Shanks and Shanks Village, yes, I have it.
You know this one? Yeah, because this is really good. The balance is on the Camp Shanks.
Yeah,
And
yes.
it could be expanded through things like this to get at more of the Shanks Village
Right.
stories. That was one of my thoughts. If we could find a way into it, then we could continue with this over time and
He
see.
mentions that people were fascinated with Shanks,
Right.
and that Margaret Mead came to.
Well, there's a photo here that, if this were standard fare, the photo on the back of it says so much, where you have Eisenhower visiting Shanks Village while he was president of Columbia University. And that brought all of the things together.
Yeah.
When he was president of Columbia, the graduate students who were living in Shanks Village. And this was truly an American experiment. It was really, this Shanks Village was really viewed as, this is what America could learn from living this way.
Well, what Eisenhower said about Shanks,
Yeah.
to me was amazing.
Yeah.
When he said it was the best damn place to live in the world,
Right?
because there are no crybabies, no whiners in Shanks. And he said, I hate whiners.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming today. I really appreciate it. Okay?
So thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it. The next program will be Thursday, November 4th, 12:30 here in the community meeting room. And I do apologize for those watching on Zoom. We did have some audio issues. We did check all the audio prior, and everything was working properly.
They all- do you know-
John, I do
Yeah,
apologize.
it's published by the Historical Society. In the city?
A little more of the
At the Historical Society.
program. Thank you for joining us on Facebook Live. And,
Okay.
You asked Jack Dunn again.
I can check a picture.
Yeah.
Shanks. Okay, thank you.
Okay.